Neurodevelopmental disorders. The neurodevelopmental disorders are a group of conditions with onset in the developmental period. The disorders typically manifest early in development, often before the child enters school, and are characterized by developmental deficits or differences in brain processes that produce impairments of personal, social, academic, or occupational functioning. The range of developmental deficits or differences varies from very specific limitations of learning or control of executive functions to global impairments of social skills or intellectual ability. Once thought to be categorically defined, more recent dimensional approaches to measurement of the symptoms demonstrates a range of severity, often with a very clear boundary with typical development. Diagnosis of a disorder thus requires the presence of both symptoms and impaired function. The neurodevelopmental disorders frequently co-occur with one another. For example, individuals with autism spectrum disorder often have intellectual development disorder, intellectual disability. And many children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, also have a specific learning disorder. The neurodevelopmental disorders also frequently co-occur with other mental and behavioral disorders with onset in childhood. Communication disorders, in parentheses, communication disorders and autism spectrum disorder may be associated with anxiety disorders. ADHD with oppositional defiant disorders. Tics with obsessive compulsive disorder. For some neurodevelopmental disorders, the clinical presentation includes behaviors that are more frequent or intense when compared with those of normal children of the same developmental age and gender, as well as deficits and delays in achieving expected milestones. For example, autism spectrum disorder is diagnosed only when the characteristic deficits of social communication are accompanied by excessively repetitive behaviors, restricted interests, and insistence on sameness. Intellectual developmental disorder is characterized by deficits in general mental abilities, such as reasoning, problem solving, planning, abstract thinking, judgment, and academic learning and learning from experience. The deficit results in impairments of adaptive functioning, such that the individual fails to meet standards of personal independence and social responsibility in one or more aspects of daily life, including communication, social participation, academic or occupational functioning, and personal independence at home or in community settings. Global developmental delay, as its name implies, is diagnosed when an individual fails to meet expected developmental milestones in several areas of intellectual functioning. The diagnosis is used for individuals younger than 5 years old who are unable to undergo systematic assessments of intellectual functioning, and thus the clinical severity cannot be reliably assessed. Intellectual developmental disorder may result from an acquired insult during the developmental period from, for example, a severe head injury, in which case neurocognitive disorder also may be diagnosed. The communication disorders include language disorder, speech sound disorder, social (pragmatic) communication disorder, and childhood-onset fluency disorder, stuttering. The first three disorders are characterized by deficits in the developmental and use of language, speech, and social communication, respectively. social communication disorder is characterized by deficits in both verbal and nonverbal communication skills that result in social impairment and are not better explained by low abilities in structural language. Intellectual developmental disorder or autism spectrum disorder. Childhood-onset fluency disorder is characterized by disturbances of the normal fluency and motor production of speech, including repetitive sounds or syllables, prolongation of consonants or vowel sounds, broken words, blocking, or words produced with an excess of physical tension. Like other neurodevelopmental disorders, communication disorders begin early in life and may produce lifelong functional impairments. Autism spectrum disorder is characterized by persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, including deficits in social nonverbal communicative behaviors, use for social interaction, and skills in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. In addition to the social communication deficits, the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder requires the presence of restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests or activities. Because symptoms change with development and may be asked by compensatory mechanisms, the diagnostic criteria may be met based on historical information, although the current presentation must cause significant impairment. With the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, individual clinical characteristics are noted through the use of specifiers, with or without accompanying intellectual impairment, with or without accompanying structural language impairment, associated with a known genetic or other medical condition or environmental factor, associated with neurodevelopmental, mental, or behavioral problem, as well as specifiers that describe the severity of autistic symptoms. These specifiers provide clinicians with an opportunity to individualize the diagnosis and communicate a richer clinical description to the affected individuals. For example, many individuals previously diagnosed with Asperger's disorder would now receive a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder without language or intellectual impairment. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder defined by impairing levels of inattention, disorganization, or hyperactivity impulsivity. Inattention and disorganization entail inability to stay on task, seeming not to listen, and losing materials necessary for tasks at levels that are inconsistent with age or developmental level. Hyperactivity impulsivity entails overactivity, fidgeting, inability to stay seated, intruding into other people's activities, and inability to wait. Symptoms that are excessive for age or developmental level. Symptoms that are excessive for age or developmental level. In childhood, ADHD frequently overlaps with disorders that are often considered to be externalized disorders, quote unquote, such as oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. ADHD often persists into adulthood with resultant impairments of social, academic, and occupational functioning. Specific learning disorder, as the name implies, is diagnosed when there are specific deficits in an individual's ability to perceive or process information for learning academic skills efficiently and accurately. This neurodevelopmental disorder first manifests during the years of formal schooling and is characterized by persistent and impairing difficulties with learning foundational academic skills in reading, writing, or math. The individual's performance of the affected academic skills is well below average for age, or acceptable performance levels are achieved only with extraordinary effort. Specific learning disorder may occur in individuals identified as intellectually gifted and manifests only when learning demands or assessment procedures time tests pose barriers that cannot be overcome by their innate intelligence and compository strategies. For all individuals, specific learning disorder can produce lifelong impairments in activities dependent on the skills, including occupational performance. The neurodevelopmental motor disorders include developmental coordination disorder, stereotypic movement disorder, and tic disorders. Developmental coordination disorder is characterized by deficits in the acquisition and execution of coordinated motor skills, as is manifested by clumsiness and slowness or inaccuracy of performance of motor skills that cause interference with activities of daily living. Stereotypic movement disorder is diagnosed when an individual has repetitive, seemingly driven, and apparently purposeless motor behaviors, such as hand flapping, body rocking, head banging, self-biting, or hitting. The movements interfere with social, academic, or other activities. If the behaviors cause self-injury, they should be specified as a part of the diagnostic description. Tic disorders are characterized by the presence of motor or vocal tics, which are sudden, rapid, recurrent, non-rhythmic, stereotyped motor movements or vocalizations. The duration, presumed etiology, and clinical presentation define the specific tic disorder that is diagnosed. Tourette's disorder, persistent (chronic) motor or vocal tic disorder. Provisional tic disorder, other specified tic disorder, and unspecified tic disorder. Tourette's disorder is diagnosed when the individual has multiple motor and vocal tics that have been present for at least 1 year and that have a waxing, waning symptom course. The use of specifiers for neurodevelopmental disorder diagnosis enriches the clinical description of the individual's clinical course and current symptomatology. These include the following. Severity specifiers are available for intellectual developmental disorder, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, specific learning disorder, and stereotypic movement disorder. Specifiers indicative of current symptomatology are available for ADHD. Specific learning disorder, and persistent motor vocal tic disorder. Autism spectrum disorder and stereotypic movement disorder can also include that specifier. The specifier associated with a known genetic or other medical condition or environmental factor, and end sentence. This specifier gives clinicians an opportunity to document factors that may have played a role in the etiology of the disorder, as well as those that might affect the clinical course. That was the neurodevelopmental section of the DSM-5 text revision. The next one in this book is intellectual developmental disorders. So I'll be reading that next when I get around to it. And yeah, I'm hoping to go through this entire thing on video. Not one video, but in multiple videos going over each different section. So that's a easy this one, all in chronological order of this text. So, yes, don't self-diagnose, and good day to you guys.